So why don't I let Ken and Jimmy introduce themselves, or introduce each other's actually.
Okay, so I get to brag about him?
Yeah.
All right,
boy.
So Ken and I have been friends for about 20 years. We both graduated in '98, and back then I was coming out of college, I was looking for a job. I ended up at a startup in Cambridge from a high school friend of mine. I think I was employee number 6, and you were employee number 4. So he was pretty much like the first person I met when I got there, because the place that we were doing the startup was also the place I slept. So that was fun. And you know, I met him, and it turned out my friend had gone to Harvard, so of course everybody else in that startup was from Harvard except me. I was like the one Michigan guy or non-Harvard guy. Like employees number 7 through 10, I think were all Ivy League, Harvard or Yale people. Anyway, we met, we did that startup for about 3 years, and you know, he ended up going to law school and doing a bunch of stuff there. I did other startups, and then we came together again when we were at Elysium. That was a litigation consulting firm. I got hired there first, and I was like, okay, law and coding, who do I know that's good at both of those? And bam, I thought of Ken. So I just want to tell you guys, this is a very talented person, and I don't say this lightly. He's one of the most talented human beings I know. He's not only a really good author, but he's also an exceptional lawyer and a really, really good coder, right? Like, and I've worked with a ton of coders. Yeah, so I want to mortify him even more. No, not only that, he's just a really genuinely good person. So
well, so now you know why I'm friends with Jimmy, because you know he's very good at making you sound good. I'm not sure really Jimmy needs an introduction at this point. He is the first person who really turned me on to Bitcoin, but he probably has done that for a lot of you as well. He is a passionate believer in the future of Bitcoin, and one of its most effective as well as vocal advocates. He has worked tirelessly to educate the community, and especially on the technical side, about how to work with Bitcoin. And I loved his book and his course. So if you have a chance and you want to get deeper into the technical side of things, definitely get his book. Jimmy is an amazing teacher. At the time, I don't know if he mentioned this, but when we first started, Jimmy actually wasn't formally trained as a programmer. When he joined the startup, he was a math major, and he just sort of knew coding as a thing that you did to get math done. He was not actually trained as a professional programmer, but you should have seen how quickly he became.
What do you remember so I applied to the company, and my friend made me do some programming exercises because I had done some in high school. I was like, last language I know is Pascal. How am I going to do this? He's like, well, just go learn C or something. I programmed the whole thing in C++ after a week and a half, and Ken looked at it, and months later, he's like, Jimmy, that was the craziest use of namespaces I've ever seen.
Yes.
And he actually was like evaluating my code. Just so you know, I forgot to brag this about him. He was like a TA for a Harvard CS class for like 6 years, right? Like, he really knows his stuff. He knows his stuff. And I couldn't have thought of a better person to help me negotiate my contract with O'Reilly. How many coder, lawyer, authors do you know, right? So anyway. By the way, I owe you some Bitcoin for what you said about me. If you have a QR code, yeah.
Okay, yeah, speaking of like a patchwork career or like different jobs, writer, lawyer, you know, how did your careers evolve to the point where you got involved with Bitcoin?
Well, I think I got him in, but I mean, I got involved in 2013. I was working a normal software developer job, and it's crazy because I still can't believe this happened. I looked for something on jobs for Bitcoin. This was a subreddit of Reddit at the time, and I looked, and there was an ad for Python developer wanted. And I was like, I know how to program Python. I'll go do this. And it turned out to be a guy from the Ukraine that wanted help on the Color Coins project. And I ended up doing that. I don't know if you guys remember 2013 and what happened in the Ukraine, but Vladimir Putin actually invaded. So I didn't hear from him for like a whole week because nothing was kind of going on. That's how I got involved. I eventually just decided this is what I need to be doing because I was just so, I was doing that 40 hours a week. I was doing my normal job 40 hours a week, and I have kids and a wife and everything, and it was just too much. So I was like, you know what? I think going this way wouldn't be a bad thing. I worked for several different startups, Monetas, Armory, Paxos, and then I decided to go off on my own and do the thing that I'm doing now, which is having more of an anti-fragile life with like 6 or 7 businesses. So yeah, but I did get Ken to write a story, and that was Byzantine Empathy, which I thought was really interesting, and you could talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, my life as a science fiction author these days, so I'm not directly involved in development for crypto, but after Jimmy sort of turned me onto the space, I got more and more interested in all the potential stories that can be told about it. So, because I'm a big believer that stories actually do matter, not in terms of predicting the future, but in terms of shaping how you think about the future. I think what's important is for all of us really, to pick the story that speaks the most truly to us about the future of money, the future of technology, the future of equality, whatever your passion is, and then try to make that story come true. Stories are no good at predicting the future, except in instances where you actually you work to make your vision come true. That's really the only way to make it happen. And I got deeply interested in the potential of blockchain and Bitcoin to transform a lot of the problems that we have in contemporary life. And I wanted to write stories that explored the subject in a way that's beyond just, cryptocurrency is used to buy drugs type of thing that seems to be the only narrative that popular culture wants to think about. I feel in some ways crypto in the pop culture sense is now where the internet was back in, say, 1994. People sort of knew about it, the technical folks were using it, but most people just have no idea what it is, and they sort of hear it and they conjure up weird visions and terrifying visions or confusing visions. And I think it's helpful for somebody like me to go in and try to tell stories that are grounded in technical reality, but actually explore the possibilities in a much more helpful and hopeful, and also I think thoughtful way.
Yeah, one of the things that was really impressive about Ken's story, Byzantine Empathy, is that it really just describes the Byzantine general's problem in story form. And that's not something that you see every day, right? Like usually when you read a story, you go, oh man, these technical details are completely incorrect. Ken's one of the few people I know that will just go to the source document for everything. So he read the white paper. If he wants to know more about some like judicial decision, he'll just go and read it, right? Like that's kind of what he does. And when he described it, I was like, wow, this is such a good intro. And this is, I think, the role of speculative fiction in a lot of ways, is that, it's hard to read technical documentation. I mean, like, it really sucks, actually. And I include kind of my book a little bit in that. It's hard to, like, sit there and do it and still kind of enjoy yourself. What fiction lets you do is add sort of that entertaining element to make it a little more digestible. And that is a really important part of getting people to understand something like that. I don't know. What do you think?
That makes sense. I think the way you describe in your book is you kind of have to eat the vegetables until you can enjoy the rest of the meal. But so, I mean, I feel like in some ways this is a little bit about a metaphor for crypto itself. You kind of have to put in the work to be able to actually enjoy the result. I mean, if you just want to hear the buzzwords and being able to spout them back, that's one thing. But if you actually want to be able to understand enough details to be able to speculate about the future and to actually create value and to convince other people, I mean, maybe some people can sell things they don't understand. That always seemed to me impossible. You kind of have to understand enough to be able to explain to people why they would want it. But it seems to me that you have to put in the proof of work to be able to show that you actually know what you're talking about, and you can actually create a vision of the future that other people will be able to understand and rally behind.
Yeah, and this was something that we were talking about. Like, having opinions or telling stories is actually kind of easy, right? And this is what most of these ICOs do. But actually implementing it, creating it, that's really, really hard. Opinions are like, a-holes or whatever.
Yep, exactly.
Everyone has one. But the actual work involved and putting something forward and doing it, that's the hard thing. That's the rare thing. This panel is about the future of money and stuff like that. We were talking about, well, what actually is money? And we came up with this kind of interesting definition. Well, it's kind of your stored labor, but it's not just any labor, right? It's if you're particularly bad at a particular activity, it's not that labor that tends to get stored, because we all have, want to maximize our value. What we do is we go towards the thing that we're best at, and then we store value with money that way. And like just thinking forward about what that looks like, and thinking, okay, what's going to happen in the future? When there is sort of like a non-government money, right? A decentralized money that we can all have access to. What does it mean to really like figure out where your labor is going to be stored the best, right? Because which one's the sort of best direction to go, and how's civilization going to change? How are people going to change? How are your relationships going to change? I mean, that's a really, like we were speculating on the whole thing.
We were sort of talking about how the system as we have it, the heavily regulated bureaucratic state and fiat currency and so on, promotes a certain kind of learned helplessness, right? It's that you don't necessarily want to maximize the value of your own creative contributions. You kind of want to rent seek. Because that is, in fact, what the whole system encourages you to do. It seems like the people who are able to offload their risks and able to get other people to take their risks, bureaucrats, are able to get the most value out of the system. But crypto seems to offer the possibility where everyone can sort of escape from that a little bit, and you actually do end up capturing the value you create rather than working for someone else.
Yeah, and this is something that I've often talked about, which is that if you're working for a company, they really only pay you for that narrow title that you might have. So if you're an accountant, they're not going to pay you to go do sales, for example, right? Like you're doing that particular thing. But when you're in business for yourself, you know yourself better than anybody. You might not be realistic about your particular talents or something like that, but that's another whole topic. What you are able to do is sell, put your labor towards the thing that you're the best at, and that's kind of missing right now, right? And like to Ken's point about like rent seeking, instead people are trying to find places where they can get in the middle of some transaction and tax it in some way and make a lot of money. What crypto does is, well, all of that inefficiency has to go away, because you are going to get destroyed by your competition if you aren't the most efficient. And you can't, and this is one of the hopeful things about crypto for me, is that, well, you can't really afford to be racist, sexist, homophobic, or whatever, because if you are, your competition's gonna eat your lunch, right? There's no favoritism here or rent seeking, because there's no real, ability to print money and sort of take power away from others and sort of essentially steal the monetary power from others. So,
right, and like part of what bothers me about a lot of our modern development is this tendency to resort to the referee more and more, the idea of the central authority. We seem to want to attribute some central authority godlike justice and fairness and unlimited powers, and we want to resolve everything that way, and we sort of actually favor centralization. But this is a terribly dangerous thing to do, the idea that we suddenly wake up one day and realize that knowledge gathering and knowledge discovery is centralized in Google, that this one search engine literally defines what is true and what can be found out about it. I was horrified when, one day I was working with somebody and they asked me a question and I gave them the answer and they said, well, I can't find that on Google, so it must not be true. And I was like, wow, we have truly come to a dystopian vision that not even Orwell thought of.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a reality shift with all this technology that's happening. And I don't know, maybe we can have a different reality that, like people sort of see things differently because that's what they're used to. And we do have this central authority that's doing that. I don't know, what do you think might be the way that we combat something like that? Because I've thought a lot about it.
I don't know. I mean, I feel like in some ways we kind of have to start by making the very infrastructure on which we construct our knowledge economy decentralized. So what I mean is the fact that the internet is theoretically and in its ideal conception decentralized and able to route around censorship of all sorts. The reality is it's exactly the opposite of that. If you know even a little bit about network topology, you will realize the amount of centralization that has occurred, not just in terms of somebody like Google, but also DNS and content delivery systems and all sorts of other actors, that we have ended up with a highly centralized network that I don't think anybody ever started out planning for. We just evolved to that way. But one of the speculative futures I sort of envision and I sort of think about a lot is, in fact, a network constructed along Bitcoin blockchain principles that are truly decentralized, so that there's no single point at which you can cut off speakers and deplatform someone. That platform risk for all of us, for every individual, is a matter of the past. That we can truly have a system in which everyone has the right to present and to speak and to create their vision and not rely on the power of leveraging some central authority, capturing it and using it to dominate the conversation.
Yeah, it's interesting because I remember back in like 98, 99, 2000, it was an anathema to have to provide all of your info to anybody. And once people started using Facebook, somewhere around there, it just completely turned around. So it started with these decentralization principles of, hey, I don't have to say my name to anybody to register on a site or whatever. It eventually became like Facebook needs to know all of this information about you before you're allowed to do anything. And it became this horrifying decentralization to centralization kind of dystopia that was happening before our very eyes. I mean, we're old enough that we saw it sort of evolved, and it was like, what happened? And honestly, I imagine that's very much a possible future for a lot of, for Bitcoin, certainly for altcoins. It's to a large extent happening to them already, where you have to register KYC, AML KYC in order to do the pre-sale for some token or something like that. It's kind of frightening the direction it tends to move when when the powers that be start sort of getting into it. I don't know.
Okay, so let me ask you this then. Do you think that the blockchain could be a tool for social change, even given all the pitfalls of maybe scams in the past or regulation that they face internationally? What do you think?
Oh, absolutely. I think it can be. The problem, though, is blockchain by itself is not going to do any of that. I mean, change comes from people, and in some ways it comes from telling the most convincing story so that most people buy into it. Blockchain really is just literally a technology. I mean, I hate to say this, but I see a lot of claims for the blockchain's potential to disrupt, and it's all really ridiculous. The stories are just, they're so preposterous that it's very hard to believe that people will believe these stories at all. I mean, it is really just a technology, and oftentimes it's being used as a shitty database. That's basically all it is. And those stories are completely not convincing at all. I do not understand why these stories seem to get a lot of traction. No, blockchain by itself is not going to do anything. Technology is nothing more than a force multiplier. It will magnify very good human tendencies and also terrible ones. I think ultimately social change is going to come from the fact that those who have a vision of the future that they deeply believe in and that they can get other people to sign on to, will use blockchain to amplify their efforts and make that happen.
Well, so I want to touch on something that you just said, which spurred a thought. You said that a lot of people tell stories as, and that's what they end up having to trust, rather than going to the source, right? And this is something that I've seen a lot in this industry, which is that instead of actually looking at the technical merits of the project, they just go with whatever the story is that the creators tell, and if that sounds convincing to them, if it emotionally connects with them,
yeah,
that's what they go with instead. So in a way, the storytelling has sort of replaced a lot of the rigor that really should be necessary to do your own research. Way too many people in this industry don't do almost even cursory research about whether something is possible or not. And this is something that I think speaks to that point about fraud and all of that, is that if you don't have the level of rigor to actually look at it, then it just becomes like a popularity contest between which story is more believable, or which story am I more excited about, or which story do I want to believe. And those are very, very different things than the actual truth and what can actually happen.
Well, that's why I think it's important to, this is one of the reasons why things like programming Bitcoin and other technical education efforts are important, because we actually do have a lot of skilled, talented, technical people. If they just get enough knowledge, they can act as a sort of truth filter. They can act as the crowd to put some checks on these kind of ridiculous stories. I mean, this is sort of, Jimmy and I were talking about how we started in the tech business so long ago that we went through this period when everybody in the world was talking about XML as though it were the magical solution to everything. Sort of like blockchain now, you sprinkle some blockchain magic dust and the solution is better than anything else before, and back at the time was XML. It's probably very hard for some of you younger ones especially to believe this, but there was one point where executives would demand that XML be a thing in every plan because that was magical, and we used to make fun of it. But it just seemed to be the sort of thing that made no difference. People would still demand it. Customers would say, "Are you XML compliant?" And we're like, "What the hell does that mean?"
Yeah, I still remember, like, we couldn't close a particular sale because we didn't have Java or something like that. It's a lot of executives kind of get caught in this idea that they can be the ones that are wise enough to tell you what technology to use. And as engineers, that is probably the worst way to offend some of us, right? Like, it's like, you don't tell us, like, I don't tell you how to do your job, why are you telling me how to do mine? That sort of thing. But there's a phrase I heard recently which I find hilarious: blockchain as an excuse. BAAE. This is like a lot of corporate departments that are like, hey, we need a nice budget for what we want to do. Hey, let's tell them that we're actually implementing a blockchain and now we have a nice large budget. That sort of mentality can definitely get gamed, right, into this, doing whatever the people want to do anyway. And it's kind of sad because I see this kind of as this mass delusion, kind of like emperor has no clothes situation, where a lot of these executives are thinking they know something when they really don't, right? They just believe the story, right? They think that this is the reality going forward, and that's the future. Like, this was, I think pretty clearly said in Ken's talk. They have a vision of the future based on the story that they've been told. And that's where they want to go, and so they try to make it a reality, not by actually implementing it, but just telling somebody else to implement whatever it is that they want. And that's kind of the tragedy that we're in. It doesn't tend to work very well.
Okay, I think we can open it up to audience questions. If anyone in the audience has a question for Ken or Jimmy. Oh, yeah, you can just shout.
My question is for Ken. I just want to say it's an absolute pleasure to hear you speak. The paper menagerie made me cry.
Thank you.
It made me cry too, yeah.
I'm very interested in authors being influenced by stuff that's not literature. The Indian author Arundhati Roy, for instance, credits portraying as an architect as shaping all of her writing. And I'm really interested to know, from one side,
Right. So the question is, how has my experience as a coder influenced the kind of fiction I write? It's really hard to answer that, actually, because in some ways I view all the professions I've had as sort of unified in some sense, because all three professions I've had as a coder, as a lawyer, and as a fiction author are really symbol manipulation jobs, although you could argue that most modern jobs are symbol manipulation jobs in which you take some symbols, move them around according to rules, and produce new symbols. And I don't actually dig ditches. I don't produce anything tangible. All I do are produce, I make more symbols. But there is a commonality to this, which is in every single case, I'm essentially acting as an engineer, because when you're a coder, you're obviously manipulating software code to construct a virtual machine. When you're a lawyer, you're actually manipulating bits of legal, ready-made legal components and to make a contract or a brief to follow the rules of the legal system to lead to a certain result for your client. And as a fiction author, I am using tropes and techniques, narrative techniques that are being honed over millennia to produce a certain emotional response in my audience. All three are actually very similar in terms of aesthetic qualities that get prized. There is such a thing as elegance in contract drafting, and there's such a thing as elegance in fiction writing too. So I think a lot of the influence from my coding days to my fiction is just this sense of aesthetics, really. I do actually tend to do things like refactoring my fiction. There are things where I'm like, this is not well done. This little bit of symbolic foreshadowing ought to be done as a pre-declaration so that this will work out well. I shouldn't be doing a back reference here. This kind of flashback is not a well used, so I will move it somewhere else. So I do things like that.
Well, there's also, he's just more technically accurate. If you look at single bit error, that's a short story he wrote. And I'm speaking more as a fan here and less as his friend. Single bit error. But there's a lot of technical details that Ken just make sure he gets right, and this is more something that I've noticed about your fiction versus other people's
Well, this
fiction.
is just because I'm obsessive. If I don't actually understand the code, I can't really write about it. So when I was trying to write my Bitcoin story, I was like, I actually have to go read the code. Otherwise, I don't really understand how it works, and I can't speculate. So
did you read Jimmy's book for that?
Yes, Jimmy didn't finish his book at the time I was writing the story, so I ended up having to backfill afterwards. Yes.
And he sent me some stories in the past to review and stuff like that. I'm always honored whenever he does that, because I'm like, wow, I get to read his fiction before everybody else.
We have time for one last question. You in the back.
How about the idealism of science fiction? So there's a thought that because the Jetsons imagined this future, that technologies were really created, and even Jurassic Park, a lot of people attribute that to a new generation of paleontologists who went into the space and all approached it differently. So how about that in terms of just prompting innovation and
I totally agree with you. I think that's actually one of the ways in which telling stories about the future actually is useful. It's not that you predict a future about dinosaurs coming to life. Literally, people will do that. That is not at all useful. It's more like along the lines you said, which is by telling stories about the future, you allow people to break out of their local maxima, right? They start thinking, look, there's this other vision. It's kind of cool. Maybe I can start thinking crazy thoughts, and they're not that crazy. And I will learn how to do something practical and then marry that vision I have with the practical skills I have to make the future come true. So in other words, I never believe science fiction authors are any good at predicting the future. So I always find it odd when science fiction authors are like, I predicted that back in 1992. And I'm like, no, you just guessed it. It's like you are lucky. It has nothing to do with skill. But science fiction authors are very good at inspiring people to think about the future in a way that says, my story about the future is within my control. I think that's the biggest contribution science fiction can do, to make everyone believe that they are actually in control of making the plot of their own lives. Lives actually have no plot, but you can shape the path you end up walking.
And that's something that I think we should all be aware of, because it's not just science fiction authors that tell stories. Everyone is telling a story in some way, shape, or form. And it's about knowing the power of that, which I think is very much clear in science fiction, because it does inspire a lot of people and results in concrete stuff. But people can use that power for good or for evil. So you have to be very responsible with that power.
So thanks, Ken. Thanks, Jimmy, for being here and talking to us today.
Thank you, Jen.
Thanks.